Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The executive director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Well, thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Tuesday. It is the 6th day of June in the year 2017. It is the anniversary of D-Day, for those of you who are old enough to remember that momentous day, which was the beginning of the end of World War II, pretty much. Today is also the anniversary, the 49th anniversary of the death of Robert F. Kennedy. And I remember that day really well in 1968, as I know many of our listeners do as well. So it's kind of a momentous day, June 6th. And so far, at least here in southern Appalachia, it's not been a momentous day. It's been a gorgeous day. After all the rainfall that we had yesterday, we had we had minor flooding yesterday, but a lot of power outages in the region and things like that. So this return to sunshine and dry weather is very, very welcome here. So in that sense, it's not meant a momentous day, but it's just the kind of day I think most folks in our area have been looking forward to. And again, it's 1.5 hours later than we usually begin our programs on Monday and Wednesday because of the Tuesday commitment that I have for the Beckley Rotary Club here in southern West Virginia. So welcome to the Virtual Center on this Tuesday, the 6th day of June in the year 2017. We're going to begin today looking at a few issues related to some of the political realities going on in the world, and I think all of them begin with a capital T, as it were. That seems to be the name of the political game. It was very interesting. I was just, before we came on the air, I was just looking over the Washington Post at some of the headline stories that are in there. I didn't have a chance because I've been at the meeting a good portion of the morning. But I looked at some of the headlines of stories in the Washington Post, which I'll make it a point to get to later. But one of them caught my eye, and I thought, it's right fresh in my mind because I just looked at it 5 minutes ago, and it's the idea that because of the example or the model set by Donald Trump, a lot of people from all different walks of life are beginning to express an interest in running for president. I guess the general conclusion out there is if he can do it, anybody can. So among the people mentioned, Jeff Zuckerberg, Oprah Winfrey, and Lord knows, I'm sure there'll be others. So I guess the implication, Donald Trump has pretty much made it clear that he's made it to the White House without any political experience, never having run for an elected office before, and he was successful. So the implication is, if you've got a name and a reputation and you have deep pockets, so to speak, you too can be president of the United States. It's really kind of a throwback to the old idea with parents who raised their children and said, in America, children can grow up to be anything they want to be. If even president of the United States, and we're kind of living proof that indeed can be possible. We would love to hear from you here at the Virtual Center. I know the listeners would, because there's no doubt that many of you listening have ideas and concerns and issues and thoughts related to some of the issues that we've been dealing with here at the Virtual Center, or issues that we will be dealing with here. Obviously, with the testimony of former FBI Director Comey coming on Thursday morning, I think we're in for a big week. The media is already talking about that as being the news highlight of the week. And of course, there's a little bit of diversionary effort coming out of the White House. I think there's been quite a focus on international affairs over the last couple of days, and there seems to be afoot an effort by the president, and the reason I say this is because he's done this so frequently before, of diverting attention away from domestic affairs and into the international arena. We'll get to that in a moment. But if you would like to get on the air, we do have a phone number that's reserved just for that purpose. Bob Kincaid is in the studios at the Head On Radio Network today. And if you call, you're going to get Bob, and he'll get you on the air very, very quickly. Just dial area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you are a little bit reluctant to get on the air, but at the same time, you've got something you'd really like to say, and I can understand that because I've been there all my life, and it's only in the latter part of my life. It was after years of teaching school or teaching public school first, and then at the college and university levels, did I become willing to speak out in a group or in a crowd. And I know that there are many people reluctant to do that. In the past, the teaching experience I had at West Virginia Institute of Technology through the month of last part of April and into middle of May, that I've talked about. We'll be back to that a little bit because I want to go back to the issue of technology a little bit more. But one of the staff people that I quite close to at the time that I was there was the division chair of the history department, fine arts, and the person she's in drama. And besides drama classes and plays and that kind of thing, she also teaches speech classes at the university level. And she was telling me, and of course I've heard this all my professional life, about how reluctant college students are to get up in front of a crowd, up in front of the group and speak. So for many of them, the speech requirement to take a public speaking class is something they dread. Many of them will put it off as long as they can. And she talked about that. And one of the things, she's one of these people that believes that the way you deal with that is you just require them to get on their feet and speak to the group so many different times on so many different topics that they get over that initial shock that comes when you first speak to a group. I know that a lot of people do have that phobia or that fear, and I can understand that. I had it myself. So if you'd like to get your thoughts or your ideas on the air and you're a little bit uncomfortable about doing it yourself, then by all means, feel free to send me an email, and I'd be glad to act as the go-between here and get your ideas on the air for you. I'll do the very best I can to express your ideas in the way that you would most want them expressed. Just send me an email at waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. That's all lowercase, no punctuation, all one word. waobrien 906@gmail.com. And I do call your attention to our Facebook page. I've continued to place things on Facebook. I put a few things on there last night. One of them I think I'll be making reference to today. If you go to Facebook, if you are a regular user of Facebook, and tens of millions of people are, as we know, just go to facebook.com and you'll come to the homepage. And there's a search box at the top. And if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you'll be into our Facebook page, and you'll come across some of the postings that I've put on there. Obviously, the most recent ones come first, and then they basically become older and older as you scroll down through previous posts. And if you do that, I think you'll recognize a few of them there because they are issues that we've dealt with here at the Virtual Center. So again, over the last 8 or 9 months, actually I've been on Facebook a little bit longer than that, I think, but I've become somewhat comfortable with it. And in fact, I've become, kind of a Facebook junkie in a sense. And that's one of the first places I go in the morning to see if I've got any communiques or any talk. And of course, one of the things that it does, which is a benefit, it's not that big a deal, but sometimes it is. In fact, I can attest to the fact that sometimes it is. It gives you a reminder of birthdays for people that you might forget. Yesterday, for example, last evening, which is the first time that I really had a chance yesterday to go to the internet. Last evening, I was looking at Facebook, and lo and behold, yesterday was the birthday of one of my step-grandchildren that I haven't seen her for about 7 or 8 years, and she's no longer obviously a child. She's got a daughter that's graduating from college and a son who already did. But I hadn't seen her for years, and I sent her a Facebook message last night congratulating on her birthday and telling her, how much I miss her and that kind of thing. And I got a word back from her that, that my message had kind of made her day, but it just made me feel so good. So there are real benefits to Facebook, no question. There are some problems with it. We talked about those, but again, I find Facebook very, very interesting because it enables me to get down on paper some of the issues and some of the thoughts I have on some of the issues of the day. As I mentioned before we came on the air today, I had gone to a Rotary meeting, and I was enjoying brunch this morning with some good friends, people that I've known here for a number of years, and we got into a conversation about the president. And a number of the people at the table are regular readers of our Facebook page, and they read my postings all the time, and they were kind of joking about it and saying, we really look forward to your comments because one of them made the point and said, and he said, I really enjoy these posts because you seem to, more often than not, as from my perspective, you seem to be nailing exactly the kinds of things that I think ought to be nailed, ought to be emphasized. And I mentioned this morning, and I said, sometimes I'm a little bit uncomfortable about it because it almost looks day after day after day as if I'm on some kind of a campaign to build support against the president and against his administration. When in effect, the reality is, as I said, even, sometimes I keep telling myself, I really need to change topics and broaden my base a little bit and get into some other issues other than just this one. But I said it's a little bit difficult because he won't stop. It just keeps coming, and it seems like some of it is more outlandish than the stuff that occurred previously, and I never believed that it could be more outlandish, but frequently it is. Today, for example, just an hour ago, there's a feature story in the New York Times. It wasn't on there earlier this morning, but it came on there mid-morning. And apparently the president is taking credit for the actions of Middle Eastern Arab countries in isolating the nation of Qatar. President Trump is taking credit for that. Now, I don't know, very honestly, and I have to be honest right up front, I have no way of knowing what kinds of discussions occurred during his trip overseas week before last. He says that he's the one that initiated this boycott among Arab nations of Qatar, because he had made a point in his discussions to emphasize the fact that one thing these Arab nations had to do was stop funding nations that funded terrorism and that funded terrorist rhetoric. And the fact is, Qatar is a major home point, if you will, for extremist rhetoric coming out of the Middle East. And supposedly, according to the media, Saudi Arabia and some other, the United Arab Emirates and a few other nations in the Middle East joined together to establish a boycott to isolate Qatar. And President Trump is taking credit for that. Now, the fact of the matter is he may be right. It may be indeed accurate. I don't know. I would say that, under normal circumstances, we wouldn't have any reason to doubt what the president says. But in this particular case, we're dealing in a situation where there's doubt to believe anything. So it's really unclear as to what's true and what's not. So that's kind of where we are. But anyway, I thought that was particularly interesting, especially since if this is true, if President Trump is indeed being truthful here, that he is the source of this boycott of Qatar, then we probably will have not heard the end of it, because it is a reality that Qatar tends to be the base of our military operations in the Middle East. Many of the sorties against ISIS camps emanate from Qatar. Our Middle East command is located there. So if we are instigating other Arab nations to take actions against Qatar and bragging about it, then it seems likely that Qatar is going to retaliate and tell us to move our bases. And if that's true, it could be very significant. And of course, the reality is Qatar is not the only source of radical rhetoric coming out of that region. One of the major sources of funding for terrorist operations comes from Egypt. And Egypt is one of our major allies in the region. So it seems to me that we're being a little bit inconsistent in our behavior a little bit. And this links to the fact that earlier today, our representative to the United Nations, the former governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, made a speech at in Geneva, in which she talked about the possibility of the United States withdrawing from the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, because there were members of the United Nations who guilty of human rights violations sitting on the council. And the argument was that they ought to withdraw, because if you are a perpetrator of human rights violations, you have no business, according to Nikki Haley, sitting on the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. Well, the nation in particular focus here is Venezuela, who sits on the council and has been guilty of some violations. But the reality is, if you listen to what President Trump has been saying over the last few weeks about the Muslim ban, about the travel ban against refugees and immigrants from specific Muslim nations, you can begin to raise questions about our human rights situation itself. So none of this is black and white. It's very complex and very confusing. And I think that's disturbing a lot of people, because it just doesn't seem that President Trump is willing to put in the time necessary to sift through some of the nuances of this very complicated diplomatic situation that he finds himself in as President of the United States. Many people are beginning to argue that sometimes his comments and his behavior suggest that he's in way over his head. And I think a lot of that remains to be seen, because there's no question that much of what he's doing are commitments he made during the campaign. And of course, we need to recall through the campaign that the president was for and against just about everything. So he left us a smorgasbord of issues, which means that he's now free to go back and pick and choose the ones he chooses to support and ignore the ones he doesn't. And it's a little bit difficult to pin him down on those, because over a month campaign lasted, he seemed to have touched upon every issue of significance in world affairs. So it's a little bit difficult. But the fact of the matter is, many people do believe that some of the nuances of international affairs are escaping this particular president, that he seems either unable or unwilling to put in the time necessary to sift through some of these very complicated situations. And the result is he's gotten us into, in the few short months he's been in office, gotten us into some very embarrassing international situations. For example, the situation with Mexico and the wall at the beginning, the situation about refugees with Australia, one of our strongest allies, the very questionable behavior with Angela Merkel when she visited the White House some weeks ago, and then more recently when President Trump was in Europe week before last. The relations between the United States and Germany seem to be pretty cold, even though the president makes the point that everything with he and Angela Merkel is just going swimmingly. So it's a little bit difficult to know. But anyway, the point is, it's a little bit difficult when you're a regular user of Facebook, and your efforts and interests are primarily in the political arena. It's a little bit difficult to ignore some of these things because they come so fast and so furious that you almost feel that you are making a major omission if you don't call attention to certain things just for fear, on the one hand, that people might miss them, and on the other hand, you don't want to create the impression that you miss them, because in many cases they're so obvious. So again, I think much of this is quite significant. Yesterday, in our conversation, we got into a number of issues related to things that are going on in Washington, especially with President Trump. And it dawned on me at the end of the program that in recent weeks, we've touched on several issues which raise, I think, some very serious constitutional questions. I think one of the things that we've pretty much established is that much of what's going on does indeed raise serious constitutional questions. We've talked in recent weeks about the president's attack on the media, referred to as the enemy of the people. Have made people, and I'm one, believe is really critical to the operation of our representative democracy. We can afford ever to ignore that. It almost seems that he's dead without any clear idea of freedom of the press is in the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights, which, as you know, are the first 10 of the states. Obviously, the founders believed those, and Madison believed, because he was the one that orchestrated the organization and structure of the Bill of Rights as the 10 amendments were finally approved for addition to the Constitution of the United States, that in this particular republic, freedoms of speech, press, and assembly, and religion were critical ingredients of what was going to make this constitutional republic functional. There's absolutely no question, if you read the writings of the founders and the speeches they delivered in Philadelphia in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention, as well as before that convention met and after it adjourned, that freedoms of the press and speech are critical. And one thing that I think is important to mention, which a lot of people don't think to mention, I think they know it, but I don't know that they're consciously thinking about it to the point that they say it and emphasize it. And that is that when the founders included freedom of speech in the Bill of Rights, on their mind principally was political speech. The reality was that the political system, as constructed by the Constitution of the United States, could not function without people having the freedom to air their points of view on issues related to political decisions. And the same goes for freedom of the press. And one of the things I did as a result of our program yesterday was, and I didn't go into any significant research project by any means on this, but I did want to, mainly the question that I was confronted was examples from the history of the Supreme Court under the Constitution of the United States in order to come across or to consult decisions by the Supreme Court which made it clear as to how important freedom of the press was to our functioning political system. And in looking at the issue of freedom of the press, I came across a number. In fact, there's one website that I found that listed what they call the top 10 Supreme Court decisions which emphasize specific aspects related to the freedom of the press. Issues like prior restraint and libel laws and various other things. The relationship between truth and falsehood is a major consideration. Many people believe that if something is true, then you have a right under the First Amendment to publish it. Well, there's a little bit of technicality here that I just wanted to call your attention to. And that is that the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, when it was adopted in 1791 and added to the Constitution, applied only to Congress, to the federal government, not to the states. It's not until the 14th Amendment after the Civil War that the First Amendment is applied to the states. So one of the things you find in a search, even one as superficial as the search I conducted after our program yesterday, one of the first things you see is that the courts generally make reference to the 14th Amendment before they mention the First Amendment when they're talking about freedom of the press. Because the fact of the matter is, in 1791, the First Amendment didn't apply to the states. It's the 14th Amendment that made that connection, that application to the states. The 14th Amendment basically claimed or said that the Bill of Rights applies to the states as well as to the federal government. But one of the cases that seems to be quite significant in the area of freedom of the press is a 1931 case called Near versus Minnesota. Near, N-E-A-R. And this is a case that the Supreme Court took on and came down on the side of the illegality of prior restraint, censorship. And the court's position, obviously, is that censorship of any kind in our kind of a political system doesn't apply, doesn't fit, doesn't square. And the Near case was about all sorts of criminal activity within the state of Minnesota and the publication of a newspaper committed to exposing illegalities in state government. And the state of Minnesota responded, the governor of Minnesota responded by passing legislation banning this newspaper from publishing malicious and scandalous materials, whether in fact they were true or not. The argument was that it created a sense of doubt among citizens about their own state government, about their own government, and that government under these circumstances had a right to protect itself and had a right to ban such a publication. When the case finally ended up in the Supreme Court of the United States in 1931, the issue came down to the question of prior restraint, and the conclusion was that it violated the First Amendment. It established the principle that government cannot censor or prohibit publication in advance, with a few exceptions. And of course, the exceptions primarily come during wartime. More recently, a case that occurred in 1976, Nebraska Press Association versus Stewart, dealt with the issue of the public's right to know. In this particular case, a trial judge kept reporters from broadcasting or publishing any accounts of the confessions made by the accused to the police. In other words, there was a public case of robbery, and I can't remember the details of the case. But those arrested for it confessed that they were guilty. But in order to guarantee them a fair trial, the judge prohibited reporters from reporting to the general public the fact that these alleged criminals had already confessed. When the case came to the Supreme Court, the court argued that the judge's order violated both the First and the 14th Amendments. Justice Warren Burger, Chief Justice Warren Burger, rendered the decision for the majority, and he said, quote, "The whole community should not be restrained from discussing a subject intimately affecting life within." Thus, it protected the press's freedom to provide information of public interest. The point is that the Supreme Court has consistently supported the importance of a free press in our political system. At the time of the Constitution, in the Virginia resolutions, James Madison talked about the essential rights of the people against both excessive legislative and executive power. He said, quote, "The people are secured not by the laws paramount to prerogative, but by constitutions which are paramount to the laws. The security of freedom of the press requires that it should be exempt not only from previous restraint by the executive, as in Great Britain, but from legislative restraint also." In 1786, before the Constitution was even written, Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to John Jay from France in 1786, said, quote, "Our liberty cannot be guarded but by the freedom of a press, nor that be limited without danger of losing it." In 1787, after the Constitution was drafted, Jefferson wrote to his friend Edward Carrington, quote, and this is the one that a lot of people have heard of, "The basis of our governments being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right. And were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate one moment to prefer the latter. But I should mean that every man should receive those papers and be capable of reading them," unquote. Jefferson's position is that people's access to information is the most important thing, the number one priority. That's why the behavior of our president in limiting, in attacking the press, calling it the enemy of the people, suggesting that the media is creating fake news and all these other allegations that it makes, is very, very dangerous. As I mentioned yesterday, one political scientist made it a point to label the media, as newspapers, as the fourth branch of government. So critical is it to the operation of our political system. It's important to mention that. Administrations throughout the history of this nation have made it a priority to try to manipulate and spin the news. But rarely do administrations take on the media and suggest that the media's quest to secure information somehow is un-American and does damage to the people of this nation. Because the fact of the matter is, in order for our government to function, the people must know, must be informed. The founders believed it, they said it, they supported it. The history of the Supreme Court supports it. Think back to the 1970s when President Nixon did everything he could to suppress the Pentagon Papers and the release of his tapes, his White House tapes on conversations between him and his staff, Haldeman and Ehrlichman and the others in the White House. And you may recall from several months back, years back, that a former professor of mine, Stanley Cutler, who taught constitutional history and law at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and participated actively in the history grants programs that we had here in southern West Virginia. Stanley Cutler was responsible for the court case that forced the release of the tapes. And Stanley Cutler wrote a monumental book called The Wars of Watergate, about the release of those tapes. And actually, he was working on a Broadway play on the issue of releasing the tapes last year when he passed away. So that's how significant this particular issue is. I came across something that I thought you might be interested in. This was a speech delivered in 1953 by John Swinton. John Swinton was editor-in-chief of the New York Times through the McCarthy era. And what he was doing at the New York Press Club in 1953 was speaking to the role of journalists in perpetrating and not challenging the era of McCarthyism in the Cold War, the behavior and character assassinations of Senator Eugene McCarthy of Wisconsin. 1953 was right at the end of the era dominated by McCarthyism, if you will. And in his address to the New York Press Club in 1953, Editor-in-Chief Swinton is very critical of the role that journalists played or didn't play during the McCarthy era. And in fact, he's being very critical of his own profession for not upholding the standards of that profession. He said that while we celebrate freedom of the press, we would do well to consider the cautionary words of those who preceded us in this profession. And then he went on to say the following: there is no such thing as an independent press in America at this state of the world's history. You know it, and I know it. There's not one of you in this room who dares to write your honest opinions. If you did, you know beforehand that it would never appear in print. I am paid weekly for keeping my honest opinions out of the paper I'm connected with. Others of you are paid similar salaries for similar things. And any of you who would be so foolish as to write honest opinions would be out on the streets looking for another job. If I allowed my honest opinions to appear in one issue of this newspaper, before 24 hours, my occupation would be gone. I'd be fired. The business of the journalist is to destroy the truth, to lie outright, to pervert, to vilify, to fawn at the feet of mammon, and to sell his country and his race for his daily bread. You know it, and I know it. And what folly is this toasting an independent press? We are the tools and vassals of rich men behind the scenes. We are the jumping jacks. They pull the strings and we dance. Our talents, our possibilities, and our lives are all the property of other men. We are intellectual prostitutes. Unquote. That's from the speech delivered to the New York Press Club in 1953 by editor-in-chief of the New York Times, John Swinton. It's one of the most critical statements about the media by a leading figure within the media, criticizing his own profession for not living up to the standards that all of them were educated to support and to reflect. It's one of the most critical statements about the media that I've ever read, especially since it comes from one of their own. I think the implication of what Swinton is criticizing journalists for here really helps us define what the role of the media must be if it is to fulfill its legitimate role in our democratic republic. The media must continue to do its job and to inform the general public about things that the public must know. It must expose actions of this administration, of any administration, to manipulate the news, to divert attention from issues they don't want revealed by drawing attention to those issues that they are more comfortable with. It seems to me that we can't afford to endorse, even for a minute, the criticisms of this president or any president, to question the legitimacy of a free press, of a media in our society. But there's something else, and I think Swinton speaks to it. And that is the degree to which the media itself is in part responsible for public attitudes and criticisms of it. There is an ethic, a journalistic ethic, that the media must subscribe to. And I would suggest, as Swinton is not suggesting in 1953, he's damn well saying that the media is violating its own creed in terms of the way it is acting in the face of McCarthyism. It is becoming an abettor of evil by fawning at the feet of those who would manipulate public opinion. So also it appears that in our world today, the media may be guilty of exactly the same kinds of things. I'm going through my materials here because here it is. Yesterday on Facebook, I posted a link to a New York Times article which basically revealed the ingredients of a media war going on between the networks. If you'll hang on with me for a moment, I'll get my, I was going to say get my ducks in order. I spent my whole life trying to get my ducks in order. I don't think we can wait. We can wait for that. The article is written by Michael Grynbaum, Grynbaum. The date, June 4th, 2017. Today is the 6th, so the 4th would have been Sunday. Let me share with you what I posted on Facebook, because it relates specifically to this particular issue. A media war. Donald Trump is in the middle of it. It's hard to say that Trump's the cause of it, because it's equally hard to argue that he's not a major player in the whole affair. I can't say definitively that this media war between the networks is caused or was caused by Donald Trump. But the reality is he's in the middle of it. And there's no question that much of what we learn suggests that anything that Donald Trump is in the middle of, he's a major player in making it happen. The issues in this media war relate to the president's addiction to Twitter. And as I've said, his apparent aversion to any intellectual development of any kind. He continues to depend for his awareness of world events on Fox and Friends weekday mornings, and his dependence on right-wing outlets like Breitbart News and the Drudge Report. These, you'll recall, are his preferred alternatives to regular Defense Department briefings, intelligence briefings on world affairs. The president said, if you'll recall, that he doesn't want regular briefings. He can't afford to waste that much time by getting the same information day after day after day on the same things. So instead, he gets his information by watching the news. And he's most comfortable with certain outlets, regularly on Fox and Friends. He's a regular listener and reader of Breitbart, of the Drudge Report. He's a regular viewer of Morning Joe on MSNBC. They've said that many times. They know he watches the program. But he has expressed confidence in Fox News, has accused Joe Scarborough, Mika Brzezinski, and the others on MSNBC of fake news, and has been especially critical of CNN for fake news. And this is me talking. In a world where intellectual laziness seems to be on the rise, this in the face of internet access to whatever information one might want, it's quite disturbing to lay so much of that failing at the president's doorstep. The internet gives us access to whatever information we might want about anything. And so for a major player, a major architect in foreign policy, to be ignorant of the realities of international affairs and yet continue to make policy in spite of that ignorance is at best disconcerting, at worst frightening. I don't feel comfortable the President of the United States of intellectual laziness. He seems to criticize for that to an intellectual effort or regular. Says an awful lot from my perspective. CNN host Aslan, A-S-L-A-N, called a man baby. Also referred to President Trump as, quote, piece of excrement. But as I've said, it's unclear. Apologies matter much anymore. We hear them all the time. Aslan's comments were in response to the president's criticism of the mayor of London, whose name, of course, is Khan, K-H-A-N. That and President Trump's seemingly insensitive use of the latest London violence, terror attack, to push for his travel ban on Muslims. Aslan's criticism of President Trump was based principally on President Trump's reaction to the Saturday night terrorism attack in London, 2 weeks after the terrorism attack in Manchester. And of course, we know that this Sunday the major benefit in Manchester occurred. Ariana Grande, Justin Bieber, and others went over for a benefit concert for the victims. Aslan lost it on CNN because he was very critical of President Trump's, first, his criticism of the mayor of London when he urged Londoners not to be alarmed, and President Trump seemingly took that out of context and suggests a major terrorist attack in which 7 people are killed and dozens are injured and people aren't to be alarmed. And of course, what the mayor was talking about was the increased police presence as a result of the terrorism attack. And what he was saying is, while there is an increased police visibility all over the place, he's urging citizens not to be alarmed by this. They're there in order to ensure the safety of citizens. President Trump took that comment, apparently, out of context and criticized the mayor of London for it. And the fact that the mayor of London is a Lebanese American with the last name of Khan, K-H-A-N, seems particularly relevant. The other thing that President Trump did, which irritated Aslan, was to use the terrorist attack in London as a justification for reasserting support for his travel ban so that he can protect the security of this country against Muslims. And for that, Aslan lost it. In pushing his travel ban, President Trump cited information, data from Breitbart, which reported the likelihood of additional instances of terrorism in Great Britain. Breitbart published a warning to Brits of additional terrorist attacks. President Trump took that headline and used it as a justification for promoting his travel ban here in America. Consequently, NBC News refused to publicize this message from the White House because Breitbart is not considered to be a reputable news source. Breitbart is an ideological right-wing rag. Breitbart also reported, quote, there would be no deadly attacks in the UK if Muslims didn't live there, unquote. That's typical or characteristic of Breitbart. That the president is citing as data to justify his support for his travel ban here in the United States. My comment on Facebook is that from where I sit, NBC's refusal to publish what Breitbart puts out seems valid. Meanwhile, on Fox and Friends, there aired a comment which proposed that Muslims in the UK be rounded up and placed in internment camps, kind of like the internment camps for Japanese Americans here in California during World War II. The hosts of Fox and Friends later disavowed this comment, calling it reprehensible, and said that this does not speak to the sentiments of the network. But it was on there. This is the kind of hostility, vitriol, between networks that I think raises serious questions about the media's important role in giving the people information. What we see here are clear examples of media not informing the public, but manipulating public opinion within the public, taking clear ideological positions on one side or the other of issues and putting them out as if they were fact, when in fact they are opinion. Breitbart is clearly opinion. President Trump supports Fox News because Fox News supports him. He said that. Not only that, but the reality is that Fox News features stories that oftentimes don't make it on the other networks. Whereas the other networks feature stories that don't make it on Fox News. And the reality of that is that it presents totally different news to the viewing public, to citizens. Which is the most important? Which is real? Which is true? The media has allowed itself to become a major player in making news rather than reporting it, rather than informing the general public on what the general public needs to know in order to ensure that our citizenry remains informed. This situation, it seems to me, has gone well beyond providing information. The media has become part of the ideological war of persuasion that pervades too many of our news outlets. CNN host Reza Aslan referred to President Trump, quote, as an embarrassment to humankind, unquote. Pretty strong stuff for a reporter. An embarrassment to humankind. Not to be done, Fox News contributor Nigel Farage, many of you remember that name because he was heavily involved in promoting the Brexit vote in the UK. He was hired by Fox News as a contributor. On the air on Fox, he also supported the idea of internment camps as worthy of serious consideration. When he did that, that's when the hosts of Fox and Friends backed off and referred to the whole idea as reprehensible. I think back to civics classes. I think back to the role of the media as the fourth branch of government. I think of Jefferson's quote in his letter to Carrington that newspapers are more important in a republic than government itself. Because if something happens to government, free, informed people will create a new one. But if they don't have information, they can't. There's no question that the role of a free press is vital to the operation of our democracy. But we are moving into a situation where that is no longer true. The media has slipped from becoming a major source of information to playing a dangerous role of making news. There's another factor here which I haven't acknowledged, but I think everybody knows it's there. And it's the fact that the media is big business. And that the number of outlets has shrunk precipitously. Most of the news we get is controlled by very, very few organizations. Major networks control huge aspects, huge portions of avenues to the general public. Newspapers have folded, have gone out of business by the dozens. Contrary opinions, different opinions about issues, important issues, are no longer being published. Because running a newspaper in today's time is big business. And only a few can afford it. So we have run into situations when overnight billionaires like Zuckerberg own the Washington Post. The owner of the Red Sox owns the Boston Globe. He bought the Boston Globe from the New York Times. What we have are major news outlets controlling the public's access to the news. These are businesses. They sell advertising. They sell time, media time, for big money. If the private sector is to pay advertising rates for access on major news outlets, they must have audience. They must be getting a meaningful bang for their buck in terms of this money that advertising costs them. It's big business. Newspapers must sell advertising Newspapers must appeal to advertisers. They are responsible to stockholders. They are responsible for returns on stock investments to stockholders, to shareholders. They are corporations in business to make a profit. We are in 24/7 news cycles. News goes on all the time. There's not the top of an hour that goes by in any day when MSNBC doesn't begin at the top of the hour by flashing on the screen that they have breaking news. And 9 times out of 10, that breaking news is coming out of the White House in the form of leaks, in the form of character assassination in one form or another. It's becoming difficult, if not impossible, for citizens in this country to be informed, because they literally don't know what to believe and what not to believe. Our education system is letting us down. We are not educating our people in order to equip them adequately to decipher hard news from innuendo, from fake news, from alternative facts. We have seen, and we've seen it here at the Virtual Center, instances of behavior by major corporations in order to challenge the hard science related to climate, to the burning of fossil fuels, to damage to the environment. We've seen situations where corporations repress news. They hire their own team of scientists to come out with alternative facts in order to challenge hard science. Literally, they are paying professionals to generate false news, fake news, as President Trump refers to it. It is a very, very dangerous situation. It raises serious questions about our entire constitutional system and its ability to survive, let alone flourish, in this kind of an environment. This is an issue that is critically important. I opened the program today by talking about the fact that sometimes it almost becomes embarrassing to go day after day after day to the same source of news in order to conduct a program. But the fact of the matter is, it seemingly never stops. We have seen a situation where this president is now engaged in a war against the media. It wasn't that long ago, in a very short term of office, that the president was at war with the courts. He's still at war with the courts over the travel ban. He's basically suggesting, and this is important, he's questioning the right of the courts to interpret the law, to interpret the Constitution of the United States. He's raising serious questions as to the whole issue of separation of powers in our political system by challenging the legitimacy and the objectivity of the judicial branch of government, he is challenging the realities of separation of powers. He is basically making the case that he is above the law, that he is the law. Louis XIV, at the height of his power, the very famous statement, c'est moi, l'état, c'est moi, the state, I am it, it is me, I am the state, I am superior to any agency or element or part of that state. By questioning the Constitution of the United States and the separation of powers which enables it to function, the president is threatening serious damage to the constitutional system, which is the very foundation of this program. I think all of us need to be aware of this. The one thing that our political system is based upon is the principle of rule of law. As much antagonism and angst as there is between the leaders of our major parties, both major parties have been consistent in their support for the rule of law. Yet we are now in a political situation where we have a president who challenges it. A president who basically makes the case that what he says is the law, and in fact is superior to what the courts say the law is. We go all the way back to John Marshall, who basically made the ruling that the purpose of the courts is to tell us what the law is to interpret the Constitution of the United States in order to make the distinction between what's constitutional and what's not. That is a function or a role that the Constitution of the United States assigns to the judicial branch of government, not to the executive branch, not to the President of the United States. And if you think back to the Federalist Papers, more specifically to Federalist number 68, and Alexander Hamilton's analysis of the judicial branch of government, Hamilton makes the case for lifetime appointments of judges and the sanctity of their salaries by basically suggesting in number 68 that the only way we can be assured that the courts can do their job is if we make them immune from the kinds of political pressures that they would experience for unpopular decisions if their jobs were at stake or if their salaries were vulnerable. Their job is to interpret the Constitution. That's the basis of the rule of law in this country. And the President of the United States, by questioning the media, by challenging the courts, by basically suggesting the need for the travel ban, whether in fact it's legal or not, the courts so far have ruled that the travel ban is not legal because it discriminates against Muslims. The next step is the Supreme Court of the United States. And of course, we know that there's been major change at the Supreme Court level with the appointment of Justice Neil Gorsuch by President Trump. Ultimately, this Supreme Court with a restored conservative majority of 4-3, is liable to rule on the travel ban. But this is the most important issue that I think we're dealing with today. President Trump, in the barrage of tweets that he put out yesterday on the travel ban in response to the terror attacks in London, the final tweet referenced what the Trump administration is doing in the face of the court's refusal to approve the travel ban. President Trump said in his last of 5 tweets yesterday that what he called extreme vetting is aimed principally at securing the nation by making sure that suspicious people coming into this country are not automatically turned loose upon the American population. He emphasized in capital letters the term extreme vetting. The implication I would suggest to you is that those who screen people coming into this country have been given instructions to pull out of line, so to speak, anyone who looks or acts suspicious. Translation, in my mind, profiling. Anyone that comes into this country that looks Middle Eastern, that looks like they might be Muslim, whether in fact they might be wearing a headscarf or not, is suspect, and clearly is subject to what President Trump calls extreme vetting. The implication here is frightening. The courts have said that the travel ban is illegal because it discriminates. The president is saying that he refuses to accept that interpretation, and that the courts are too slow. And so he is also saying in that tweet that since the courts are so slow, we're taking it upon ourselves to do what we have to do, what we feel we have to do in order to protect the nation. This is me talking, whether in fact it's legal or not. It is entirely possible, if one takes President Trump's tweet from yesterday literally, it is entirely possible that this administration is engaged in the violation of human rights in the face of refusal to do that by the judicial branch of government. It is entirely possible that the administration is breaking the law, which at this point is the court's interpretation that his travel ban is not legal. His statement about extreme vetting is him asserting that it is legal regardless of what the hell the courts say. I would suggest to you that's a violation of rule of law. That's a violation of the whole basic principle, legal principles on which this republic is based. It's a violation of the separation of powers in the Constitution of the United States. President Trump took an oath to support the Constitution of the United States, he is currently in violation of that oath. The way I read it, the way I read him, and the way I interpret what he says. Yesterday, an article was published. I'm looking through my notes here. By David Leonhardt, Leonhardt, David Leonhardt, entitled Presidency. And David Leonhardt, in yesterday's New York Times, raises the question about the president's violation of rule of law. And he goes through various areas. Seems to be raising serious questions about the interpretation of the headings in this article that I think is worth reading. The first one, a law enforcement politicized, undermined. The third one, Team Trump, above the law, making reference, for example, to foreign officials seeking favors in the White House, people buying Ivanka Trump in other nations, the president's refusal to release returns. The implication is Trump is behaving as if he was above the law. Here's a citizen's unequal. The final debates. I will totally accept the results of this great and historic president if I win. Unquote. And then finally, the idea of the monopolization of truth. The administration is out to undermine the very idea of facts as being facts. He is questioning the legitimacy of the Congressional Budget Office, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the CIA, scientists, and the news media. In all of these areas, the president is acting as if he was above the rule of law. I would suggest to you here on the 6th day of June in 2017 that in this particular area, the President of the United States seems to me to be in violation of the Constitution of the United States and in violation of his oath to uphold it. And with that, I note that we are at 1 minute before the top of the hour. So with that, let me thank you for tuning in to today's program here at the Virtual Center. I invite you back tomorrow. We'll be back to our regular start time, which will be 1 p.m. Thank you for your continued support of this program and of the Head On Radio Network, Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the folks at Head On. Continue to appreciate your continued wonderful support. Thank you. And if you have friends who you believe would benefit from tuning into our programs, then by all means, give them the opportunity to do so by giving them the White Rose Society address, headonradionetwork.com, whatever else you might do. Friends and acquaintances to tune into our programs. The more people that think about the issues we raise here on the Head On Radio Network, the better off all of us will be. Have a great evening. Thank you for your continued support. Be nice to each other. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.